I'm going to show you how to do something that thousands of people want to know how to do. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing. Welcome everyone. In the opening, I said I was going to show you something that thousands of people want to know how to do. And true to my word, I'm going to show you how to do that.
We interrupt this video for an important message.
You read right. VVork has hit 1,000 subscribers. It's kind of funny. It took 5.5 years to get the first 500 subscribers. You guys have doubled that number to 1,000 in less than a year since then. But anyways, thanks everyone for subscribing. Let's get back to the video. As you can see here from the title, what we're going to be talking about in this particular video is how to create virtual machines using vRealize So instead of manually creating these VMs, we're going to create them programmatically with a vRO workflow. And again, we're not just going to create one VM, we're going to create 1,000 VMs. That's one for each of you VVork YouTube subscribers. So that's what we're going to do. But you might be thinking to yourself, I thought I already saw a video from Brian that said how to do that. And in fact, if you remember video number 9 from the 10-part video series on orchestrating with vRealize Orchestrator, I should say automating with vRealize Orchestrator, part number 9 already tackles this issue in part. It shows you how to create a virtual machine using a vRealize Orchestrator workflow, but it only shows you how to create one. I don't want to have to run that workflow 1,000 times, one for each of you guys. I want to automate this. So that's what we're going to do. And the other reason why I'm creating this video, besides celebrating the 1,000 of you out there, is because part number 9, that older video that was created in 2016, is written for the older Orchestrator client, the one that's the Java-based client. And as you probably already know, if you're using vRealize Orchestrator 8, the Java client is no more. It's gone. Instead, you have to use the new HTML5 client. So this video is going to show you how to not just create one VM, but multiple VMs, 1,000 VMs, using the new HTML5 editor. So let's jump in. Here's the overall plan of attack. I'm going to start out by showing you how to create an orchestrator workflow that you can use to create one virtual machine. Then we're going to make a number of incremental modifications and enhancements to do things with that original workflow. So in the original workflow, we're first of all going to hard code the name of the machine that we're going to create, or maybe we'll just ask the user to specify that. And additionally, we are going to modify the newer versions of the workflows so that we generate the machine names automatically. Furthermore, we are going to embed a loop into our orchestrator workflow. So instead of having to run the workflow 1,000 times, we just run it once, tell it how many times we want it to run, and away we go. And then, after we get that working, we'll test it by creating 3 VMs, maybe 10 VMs, maybe 100 VMs. But the real kicker here is at the end of the video, when I'm going to let that workflow run crazy, and we're going to see what happens when we attempt to create 1,000 VMs. Now, I should tell you in advance that my lab environment is way too small to handle 1,000 virtual machines. So I fully expect that workflow is going to wreak havoc in my lab environment. But hey, we're celebrating. We're having some fun to recognize 1,000 of you out there who are watching this. Anyways, let's get started. So it's time to head to the lab. As you can see, we're in the lab environment. We're logged into the HTML5-based vRO client, and we want to create a workflow. So the first thing we're going to do is go to Library, Workflows, and we're going to click New Workflow to create, you guessed it, a new workflow. So the first thing we need to do is give our workflow a name. So why don't we call this workflow, to start with, we'll call it Create One VM, because that's all this original workflow is going to do. But we're going to learn a lot about Orchestrator just by creating this simple workflow. Later on, I'll show you how to create lots of VMs. So let's create our workflow. And I'm going to shortcut some things. You guys, if you've watched my videos before, know that I'm a big stickler for typing descriptions like we see down here on the bottom of this page and so forth. But I want to jump more quickly to this. So we're going to head straight to this Schema tab here. And in the Schema tab, as you know, this is the area where we're going to develop the schema for our workflow. The schema is that flowchart looking thing that tells the workflow, that tells Orchestrator what we want the workflow to do. And while we could use something like a scriptable task and type a bunch of JavaScript code to create the virtual machine, there already is a workflow. In fact, there are multiple workflows that know how to do that. So what I'm going to do is drag in this workflow element, just like I would have in the, let me grab that. There we go. I'm going to drag the workflow element into my workflow, just like you would have done with the Java client. I'll simply let go. And unlike the older Java client, where it immediately asks you which workflow do you want to call, here, as you can see, it just pops up an interface where I'm going to have to tell it that. And specifically, the place I tell it which workflow I want to call is right here. So let's choose to call the workflow called Create Simple. I'm going to have to spell it correctly here. Create. Off to a bad start here. Let me try that one more time. Create Simple Virtual Machine. As you can see, that's enough to match it. This is one we want. Alternatively, you can use tags to search for the things that you're looking for, but I know the name of the workflow I want to call is Create Simple Virtual Machine, so I'm simply going to select it. And now that I've done that, unlike the Java client that you may be accustomed to, there is no automatic renaming of this schema element. It still says workflow element, so I'm going to come over here and change the label. Let's see, I'm going to change the label to something like Create 1 VM. All right. Okay, so there's a bunch of other things I could do. Again, I could type a description and so forth, but what we really need to do here is to start setting up some of the inputs to the workflow that we're calling. Now, strictly speaking, these are not the inputs to the workflow that we're writing. These are inputs to the workflow that we're calling. We're calling Create Simple Virtual Machine. That's somebody else's workflow. It's actually one that VMware provides. And that workflow insists that we provide it certain inputs, such as what's the name of the VM, the new VM? What do you want it called? What operating system are you going to install into that virtual machine? Which VM folder do you want the virtual machine stored in? Plus other simple things like how many CPUs do you want the VM to have, how much memory, how much disk space, and so forth. So those are all the inputs of the workflow that we're calling. Now, if you're watching carefully and you're familiar with the Java-based client for vRO, you may notice that there's a little bit of different terminology here. So let me make certain that any of you who are coming from the vRO 7 world know how to translate some terms that you know into the new terminology in vRO 8. So back in the days of vRO 7, we had things called input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. You can take a look at the Automating with vRealize Orchestrator video series to find out what those are if you don't already know. The reason why I'm listing input parameters, output parameters, and attributes here on this slide is that those things that used to be called by those names in vRO 7 have new names in vRO 8. The new names for the equivalent things are called inputs, outputs, and variables. Input parameters are now called inputs, output parameters are called outputs, and attributes are called variables. In some ways, I actually like the name change. I love the fact that I don't have to say input parameters, output parameters. I can just say inputs and outputs. That's nice. I'm a little perplexed, though, why we changed attributes to variables. I suspect they changed the name attributes because that name's scary and it throws people off. Oh my gosh, what's this attribute thing? But I kind of wish I don't know what I would have called it instead, but I wouldn't have called it variables because I personally have always referred, back in the vRO 7 days and before that, I've referred to all of these things collectively as variables. So, a little warning here, I'm still trying to transition to saying the word variables instead of attributes. We'll see how well I do in this video. But in this video, if I say variables or attributes, I essentially mean the same thing. Okay, so that's the new terminology. So over here in the lab environment where we are actually connecting up our inputs to this workflow that we're calling, again, we can see that we've got lots of different inputs that we need to specify. Now, In the vRO 7 days, we actually had multiple ways that you could hook up those inputs. We had some techniques involving some tabs called the ins tab and the outs tabs. We also had something else called visual binding in the setup wizard. Now what we have is every time you drag in something like a workflow element, like we have here, you have this input section for all your input parameters, and down below, we also have a section called outputs. So that's where we're going to go to set these things up. Why don't we start simple? We need to set up those inputs, but let's start with this output first. So we're going to go through all these inputs that you see up top here shortly. And the result is when this workflow runs, vRO is going to create a new virtual machine over in vSphere. And as a reward, it's not just going to create the virtual machine, it's also going to provide us with an object that represents that virtual machine. That object is going to store everything that we might ever possibly need to know about that virtual machine. Plus, that object is going to give us the ability to do things to the VM from our orchestrator workflow. So even though the VM exists over in vSphere, this object that I'm talking about, that's going to be our output, is going to allow us to do things like power on the VM or power off the VM or rename the VM. Those all involve something called methods. So the workflow that we're calling, create simple virtual machine, has this variable called new VM. And what we're going to do is create a variable in our workflow, the one that we're writing, and we're going to connect those two variables, those two outputs together. So my workflow is going to have an output parameter that I'm going to connect to his output called new VM. Now the names of these two can match. They don't have to. To illustrate the point that they don't have to, I'm going to create an output in my workflow that has a completely different name. So to create the output that I need, I could either go to the Outputs tab. The Inputs Outputs tab is where you go to create either of those types. There's also the Variables tab where you can create what used to be known as attributes. But right now what I want to do is to create, well, actually, I don't want to create an output parameter in this case. Now, you can watch other videos and I'll explain why, but the main reason why I don't want to create an output parameter here is that if I create an output parameter for my workflow, I'm not going to have as much flexibility over what I can do with the object. I'm going to find it more useful to create something called a variable, formerly known as an attribute. So when I go to the output section, that's the outputs for the workflow that we're calling. When I go to that output section, it tells me, here's the type of object, a VC::virtual machine. I'll show you later on where you could look up the definition of a VC::virtual machine. But the key thing I need to do here is go over to where it says select variable. I'm going to click there. And if I had already created a variable, either a variable or an output that is of the right type, if I had a variable or an output that was type VC::virtual machine, I would see it here and I could simply select it. On the other hand, if I have not yet created that output or that variable, instead of going to the Variables tab or the Inputs Outputs tab, I can just say, let's create a new output. Or in this case, we're going to create a variable, formerly known as an attribute. So we'll click Create New. And as you can see, I have the choice of creating a variable or an output. Again, in vRO 7, this would have been called an attribute, and this would have been called an output parameter. Now again, I'm going to choose to create a variable because it's going to be more flexible. I'm going to be able to do more things with it if I do that. The default name for my variable is going to match his name. So he has an output called new VM. My variable is going to be called the same thing unless I come along and do exactly as I'm doing here, which is to change the name of my variable. Now, you'll notice here that my variable name is similar to his, but my variable name is longer and should be pretty easy to spot here in a few moments. Additionally, notice here I'm using camelCase. If you don't know what camelCase is, when we create variable names and other things like that in Orchestrator, when we have a variable name that's comprised of multiple names shoved together, camelCase is a naming convention in which we capitalize letters in the name of the variable to make it easier to read. Alternatively, you can use underscores in between those names, but then You can use underscores in between the words in the variable name, but the variables just end up being really long that way. So we're going to use camelCase for all of our variables here. Again, I have the opportunity to type a description. So this is the newly created VM. And I don't get to change the type because my type has to match his type. I could set the value, and oftentimes we will. For instance, in this case, the value is a virtual machine. So I could actually go in and find a virtual machine and set that variable to a specific virtual machine, like this one here. But oftentimes when you create a variable, an attribute, you're not going to bother to set the value because the workflow is going to set the value. In this case, the workflow that we're calling is going to set the value, so I'm just going to leave that blank. So I've said I want a variable, formerly known as attribute. I gave it a name, I gave it a description, and I intentionally left the value field blank. So we'll hit create. So we're completely done with our outputs that we need to hook up, but we've got a whole bunch of inputs that we need to hook up. So let's go back. And by the way, I've changed the label here. You may have noticed that the label hasn't changed actually over here. Let me see if I can perhaps save it and jog it into, there we go. It's changed the name now. All right, so first thing that we need to do is to have a input that allows either us, the developer, or the end user who's going to call our workflow to specify what the name of the new VM should be called. Now, we can do that in multiple ways. Again, since this is an input, I can hook his input up to an input parameter of my own, or those variables I talked about before are very flexible. I could use a variable instead. In this particular case, I'm going to choose to go to the Inputs tab to create a new input for my workflow. Let's do that. So I'm going to click on Inputs. And when I do so, you can see I currently have no inputs, but to create a new input, I'm simply going to say name. Excuse me, I'm going to click New. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I pick whether I want an input or an output. And then here's that name I was just jumping ahead and talking about. The default name for my inputs is going to be in_0, in_1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are horrible default names that we expect you to change to something more useful. For instance, I could pick the same name that he did. He called his vmName. Or if I want to, as I showed you before, I could choose to have my variable have its own very unique name. All right, so virtual machine name looks like a perfectly reasonable variable. In the case of inputs, we definitely want to type a description because this is what the end user is going to see when they run our workflow. This is what we're going to prompt them. So I'm going to say the description of this variable is name of the new VM. So the new VM that's going to get created. And since we're asking for a name, it would be appropriate to use a string. Now, we don't want to ask the user for multiple names. If we did, we could just simply check this checkbox here to turn this variable, this input, into an array. We're instead going to leave it as just a single string and click Create. So now I have a single input called virtual machine name, and I want to use it over there in my schema again. So I'll go back to my schema tab, and I'll select the workflow that we're configuring. And over in the input section, let's scroll a bit here. For vmName, I can either create a new input or variable that's of type string, or by clicking over here, instead of creating a new one through this interface, I've already gone over to the Inputs tab to create the variable, and all I have to do is select it. So let's select that variable. All right, now we've done one of the inputs, but we got a whole bunch more. So let's look at the, we could look at the next one, but you don't have to do these in order. Why don't we jump to another one that's nice and simple, like vmNbOfCpus. That's going to ask either the end user who calls our workflow or ask us, the developer, how many CPUs this new VM should have. Now, I let the user set the name of the VM by creating an input. That's what inputs do. Inputs allow the user to have control over the value of something like the VM name. I could do the same thing with the number of CPUs. I can set that up as an input, but if I allow the user to set the number of CPUs as an input, then I run into the danger that the user is not going to know what they're doing. Instead of typing a reasonable number like I want 1 CPU or 2 CPUs or 4 CPUs, they could type much larger numbers. Now, vSphere supports much larger numbers of CPUs in the hundreds, but I'm going to just take this whole question of how many CPUs completely out of the hands and out of the control of the end user by, instead of creating an input, I'll create a variable, again, formerly known as an attribute. To do so, I could either go to the tabs up above. For instance, if I want to create a variable, I'd click the Variables tab. Tell you what, we'll do this once. I'm going to click the Variables tab just to show you that you can do it this way. I typically don't do it this way because it takes multiple steps. I can do it faster the next way I'll show you, but I can create a new variable. There's the variable that we created before, but I'm going to create a new variable. And I'm going to call this one, again, my name doesn't have to match his name exactly, so I'm going to make it not match. I'm going to say number of CPUs. And actually, these aren't physical CPUs, they're virtual CPUs. So that would be real clear here. Now, I always set a description for my inputs because that's what the user is going to be prompted. I should type a description for all of my outputs, and I should type a description for all of my variables, formerly known as attributes. And in the case of this particular one, I'm going to do so. I'm going to say number of vCPUs for the new VM. And again, I should do that with all of my inputs, all my outputs, and I usually try to do it with all my variables, my attributes, but admittedly, sometimes I'll skimp there. All right, the type of my variable needs to match his. You can't see it now because I flipped away from the screen. We saw this before, but his variable is not a string. His variable is a number. So I'm going to change my variable type from string to number by clicking the X button that I just clicked there. And I'm going to say that the type of variable I need is a number. So we simply type what type of variable we want, select it, and we'll talk in other videos about what configuration elements are, but we'll leave that for now. And here, I am going to set the value of this variable because the workflow that I'm calling isn't going to automatically set the value of this variable. In fact, it needs us to set the value. And the user's not going to set the value in this case because it's a variable. It's not an input. So I'm going to hard code this so that every VM that we create using this workflow is going to create a single vCPU VM. All right, so we've got, what do we got now? We've got a ways into this here. We've got one of our inputs set up for the vmName, another for the, well, actually, why don't we have the number of CPUs? Well, the answer to that question is because it's not enough to simply create the variable, or for that matter, the input and the output using these tabs here. Instead, going to these tabs here is simply creating the variable. If you want this schema element to bind to those variables in our workflow that we just created using these tabs, you need to specify that here. You select the workflow that you want to use, the variable. You go to his variable that we want to connect our variable up to. Again, there's the type of variable. And then we simply go over to select variable. And notice, even though we have multiple variables, the only one that's showing up here is the one and only variable that I have that's the right type. So it makes it really easy to find the right one. So we're going to choose number of vCPUs. And we're just chugging on along. So let's do a couple more simple ones like memory size and disk size. So with memory size, it too wants a number. If I want to let the user control this, I'd create an input. On the other hand, if I want the user to not have control over how much memory, and instead I want to hard code that, I could create a variable. In fact, that's what I'm going to do. To create a variable for vmMemorySize, I could go to the Variables tab, create the variable, then come back here to the Schema tab and bind his variable to my new variable. But as I said before, we can do this much more quickly just by staying on the Schema tab, clicking Select Variable, and choosing, well, here, that's the right type of variable, but is this the right variable? Do you want a 1 megabyte VM? If I bind number of vCPUs and vmMemorySize together, while that's technically legal and valid, it's not what we want. We want to have a new variable that we're going to use to store the amount of memory. So we'll click Create New. And in here, again, I should type descriptions for all these things, but I don't want to take up all your time here, so forgive me. I'm not going to type descriptions probably for any more of these, but I should. Because even though the end user doesn't see these variables, I, the developer, and my coworkers see this workflow and its variables, and if we don't document the variables by typing a description, it just becomes more confusing. So we're cheating here, but we're doing so to save some time. So I'm going to go with the same name for my variable as his input's called. His input's called vmMemorySize. I like that name. I'm going to leave it alone. If I wanted to, I could change that though. And for that matter, while I'm at it, while I'm creating this new variable, it doesn't have to be a variable. If I wanted to, I could create an input to give the user control. But again, in this example here, I want to control everything except for the name of the VM. So I'm going to choose to make this a variable. So since it's a variable, and since the workflow is not going to set the value, I need to set the value. So I'm going to say every one of the VMs that we create using this workflow is going to have a gigabyte of memory. Notice here that this variable is in megabytes. So 1024 megabytes is 1 gigabyte. Each VM is going to be 1 gigabyte. Let's click Create, and we'll go to the next input, which is vmDiskSize. Again, I don't want the user to have control over this. I want to control it. I, the developer, want to control this. So I'm not going to create an input. I'm going to create a variable, formerly known as an attribute. And I could go to the Variables tab to create that new variable, but you already know that I've got a shortcut here. I can just go over here to this drop-down list, click it, choose Create New. Again, I've got some variables that are the right type, and I could successfully bind to them if I selected them, but I don't want to select them because I need a new variable to store the amount of disk space. So I'm going to click Create New. And again, if I want to, I can change the name, I can type the description. I can't change the type because, again, when I'm connecting my variable to his variable, my variable's type has to match his type. So I'm not allowed to change this, but I can, if I want to, if I need to, hardcode the value. And I'm going to hardcode it in this case to, let's make each VM have a 100 gigabyte disk. So whereas the vmMemorySize is in megabytes, this variable here that he's expecting us to pass in as an input is in gigabytes. How do I know that? I'll show you how later on. Let's click Create. And next, what we're going to do is take care of the fact that I know that I do not have that much disk space in my lab environment. I can probably create a handful of VMs that have 100 gigabytes of disk space, but I'm going to very quickly, far sooner than my 1000th VM that I ultimately want to create, I'm going to run out of disk space. So we got to do something here. Well, that's what this variable down here is about. Or I should say this input. He has an input called diskThinProvisioned, which isn't a string. It's not a number. It's a Boolean. It takes a value that's either yes or no, true or false, on or off. It's a Boolean. And again, I don't want the user to control whether or not the disks are going to be thick or thin. If I create thin disks, that's going to save a lot of disk space. Yes, there's administrative overhead, but I need to save some disk space here. So I'm going to say I want a thin provision disk, and I don't want the user to be in control, so I'm not going to create an input. Instead, I'm going to create a variable. I'm not going to go to the Variables tab. Again, I'm going to take our shortcut and go over here. Say create a new variable. And again, I get to pick the name. I can change it if I want, but I'm going to leave that. I'm not going to type a description. I should, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to change the type or whether it's one Boolean or multiple Booleans because I'm not allowed to. But I do get to set whether I want this variable set to true or false, or on or off, or yes or no. Booleans can be used to represent lots of different things, but it's one choice or another choice. So in the case of the HTML5-based vRO client, it's not quite labeled here as clearly as I personally would like. I'm going to submit a feature request to get them to either label this checkbox as either when you click it, it means true, or maybe there should be a label here that says on, or maybe there should be a label that says yes. But it's not clear just by looking at this here whether check means on or off. Well, you figured it out, and I figured it out, but I just think we should label that there. So from here now, any booleans we see, if we check the checkbox, that means true, on, yes, or whatever we want, as opposed to false, off, no. Okay, so yes, I want thin-provisioned disks. Otherwise, my attempt to create 1,000 VMs is going to blow up after about 10. So let's create this new variable. All right, we're chugging along. Now we start running into some more complex inputs that we need to specify. For instance, this one here called vmGuestOs. Oh my gosh, that's a variable of type, or an input of type virtual machine guestOs identifier. GuestOs identifier. What the heck is that? Well, you'll probably understand this type most easily if I just actually set its value. So I need either an input or a variable in my workflow. I could go to the variables tab and or the inputs tab, but I'm going to shortcut it for the same reasons before and simply click on select variable. And again, I'm going to create a new variable. And it's going to be a variable, not an input. The user's not in control. It's going to be a variable that I control, and I get to set its value. I also get to set its name, its description, and so forth. But let's go see what the possible values are. I click here and it doesn't do anything because it wants me to search for something. So let's go search for something. What if we type something like Windows? Notice if I type a substring here, it's giving back a list of things that match what I typed. And in this case here, these are the different guest operating systems that vSphere supports that are Windows-based operating systems. We also have entries in here for Linux and Linux of various distributions and exciting operating systems like DOS and so forth. I'm going to pick DOS here, so good old DOS, dumb operating system. It doesn't really matter what I pick here because between you and me, we're not actually going to be installing OSs into these machines. Again, I'm trying to create 1,000 of them. If I put it, even though the disks are thin provisioned, if I start trying to shove OSs into these machines, I'm going to run out of space in my tiny, tiny lab environment way too fast. So I'm going to choose dumb operating system and create. Yes, I know it doesn't stand for dumb operating system, but I'm old and crusty. That's what I think of DOS. Anyways, continuing onwards by clicking create. That one wasn't so tough. So all of vc::virtual machine guestOs identifier is an object that defines the different types of OSs that VMware supports. You just tell us which one, and that way vSphere will know things like which version of VMware tools to install into the virtual machine, which virtual SCSI host adapters are applicable, and so forth. But we're just going to end the discussion of vc::virtual machine guestOs identifier here by clicking create. Okay, what else do we got? VMs get stored in VM folders. Let me actually go over here to the vSphere client. Yay, it looks like I'm still logged in. I thought for sure I was going to be timed out and have to log in again, but we got our 4 different usual views in the vSphere client. So the host and clusters view, the VMs and templates view, data store view, networking view. I'm most interested for right now in this view called the VMs and templates view. And in the VMs and templates view, you can organize your virtual machines by sticking them into these things called VM folders. So this thing here called Discovered Virtual Machines, that is a VM folder that's automatically created for you by VMware. Lab-VMs is not created automatically by VMware in vSphere itself. Rather, this is just a VM folder that my coworkers created. I created this one here called My VMs. If we want to, we can use VM folders for organizing other things like templates. But notice here a couple things. Notice here that I have created a folder, a VM folder, that we're going to be putting our virtual machine into, called My VMs. The other thing I want you to notice is that here in the vSphere client, we see 1 VM folder, 2 VM folders, 3, 4 VM folders. Now remember, commit that number to memory. We're going to see these VM folders again here shortly, but remember the number 4. So the reason why I brought you over here to the vSphere client is to show you that I have a VM folder called My VMs. Our workflow is going to stick newly created VMs into that folder so that it'll be real obvious. Notice right now that that VM folder is completely empty. There's no VMs in it. So it'll be really obvious if my workflow is working because the VMs will land in here. Okay, so back to the vRO client. In the vRO client, we need to say what VM folder we want the newly created VM to land in. Again, I'm going to stop talking about whether we want to create a variable or an input parameter or an output parameter and why I don't have to go to these tabs. I think I've run that one into the ground. So from now on, all of these inputs that his workflow has are going to be variables in our workflow for the reasons I've discussed previously. So his input called vmFolder is going to get hooked up to a new variable attribute that we're just about to create. So we're going to go to vmFolder. We're just about to click on this drop-down list here, which you know is going to allow us to create the new variable. But just before we do, notice that this variable that we're creating needs to be a vmFolder. That's an object that's defined by the vCenter plugin for Orchestrator. It's an object that defines those different VM folders. Each VM folder is stored in an object, and that object stores all the information that we'd ever want to know about the VM folder, such as what its name is. Plus, of these objects have methods that allow us to do things like rename the VM folder or destroy the VM folder. So that's what this vm folder business is about. So let's go over and click Select Variable. We're going to choose to create a new variable. And from here on out, again, I'm not going to describe that I could click these, that I could change the name, that I could type a description, that I can't type the type, I can't change the type. All I'm going to be focusing on from here on out are the values that we're setting these variables to. And again, I could leave this variable blank, but I'm not going to because it's not the workflow that's going to set the value. It's me, the workflow developer. I'm going to set the value right now by, jumped ahead a little too quickly there, by clicking on Search for Value. Now, since the thing that we're searching for is a complex object of type vmFolder, this window has popped up to enable us to browse this tree-like hierarchy of objects to find a VM folder. And what I'd like you to see, first of all, is that this hierarchy looks very similar to the hierarchy that we know and love from the vSphere client. So the same hierarchy that we're seeing here is the same hierarchy that we're seeing over here in Orchestrator, but they look a little different. The reason why they're different, actually, let's talk about why they're so similar, first of all. They look very similar because they're showing you the exact same thing. Both of these are showing you the vCenter hierarchy of objects. You might think of the vSphere client as showing you the vSphere client inventory, but this is not the vSphere client inventory. Strictly speaking, these are objects in vCenter. The vSphere client just happens to be the tool that we're using to display those. And similarly, over here in the Orchestrator client, this is not an Orchestrator inventory. This is the vCenter inventory. The same inventory that we're seeing, but the Orchestrator client intentionally displays some things a little bit different about the vCenter inventory. First of all, you'll notice at the very top, it's slightly different. It's got the same icon, but up top here in the Orchestrator view of the vCenter inventory, the topmost object represents the vCenter plugin that allows Orchestrator workflows to do things in vCenter. On the other hand, the top level object here in the vSphere client is not a plugin. It's certainly not an Orchestrator plugin. It's actually an Orchestrator server called sa-vc sa-1 ... So the top objects, when you're looking in these two different views of the vCenter inventory, the topmost objects aren't quite the same. This vCenter object that we see here in the vSphere client is actually the second object in the vCenter inventory that we see over in Orchestrator. So even though the icon looks a little different here, this is our vCenter server. So if I want to find the VM folder that we're going to put virtual machines into, I got to drill my way through the vCenter server, and then I got to continue onwards here. I'll explain exactly how I get to this path in a few moments, but notice that there's this folder called VM. That is a VM folder, and in fact, when I selected that's what I'm looking for is a VM folder. And when I select a VM folder, this select button ungrays. If I unselect it and try to select anything else, the select button doesn't ungray. In fact, the select button is going to remain grayed out until I find a VM folder like this one. But you know from a few moments ago that we've got more than one VM folder, and you also know that we didn't see one called VM, so what the heck is this? We'll find out in a moment, but let's expand here and notice that if we expand, we see those 4 different VM folders that I showed you earlier in the vSphere client. In fact, let's go back and see them again. Here's the vSphere client. We've got VM folders called Discovered Virtual Machine, Lab VMs, My VMs, and Templates, and those are exactly the same 4 VM folders that we see here. The only difference in the orchestrator view of the vCenter inventory is that you see this VM folder. The one called VM is not a VM folder that we created. The VM folder is created automatically whenever you create a vCenter server. It automatically creates a VM folder called VM, but that folder is hidden from you over in the vSphere client. vSphere client never shows you the VM folder called VM. It shows you all the VM folders that you create, but this one called VM here is created automatically. It's hidden from you. So if you're a vSphere administrator, it's hidden from you in the vSphere client. But we, orchestrator developers, want to see not just these 4 VM folders, but also this one, because sometimes when you create a VM, you don't want the VM to land in one of those 4 VM folders. You want it to land like, let's randomly pick one here. This VM is not in a VM folder. It might look initially that it's in the templates VM folder, but notice that the indentation here, it's not in the templates VM folder, nor is it in this VM folder or this VM folder or this VM folder. It's not in the VM folder. If you select VM, that's where your VM is going to land. On the other hand, if we say My VMs, then every single VM that our workflow creates is going to land in the folder called My VMs. That's exactly what we want. So we're going to click Select. Just before I leave though, anytime this tree browser interface shows up, make certain that the first thing that you do is take a look at the title bar, because the title bar is telling you what type of object that you're looking for, and the select button is going to remain grayed out until you pick the right type of object. Always look at that title bar so that you know what you're trying to select. All right, let's continue onwards here. We'll click Select. And next up, what do we have? Next up, we need to click Create. And now we've got the VM, where's VM folder? We've got the VM folder input set up. And we're going to do similar things with other variables, such as, where's vmHost? Let's do that next. So vmHost, as you might guess from the name, is going to ask us, which host do we want the new VM to land on? And we're just going to shortcut this here. We're going to jump straight to creating a variable for that by clicking Select Variable, Create New. Again, I'm going to skip over all the details up above here because you're tired of hearing me talk about them. Instead, we're going to click on Value to set the value. Again, this variable that we're creating is going to specify the host that we want the VM created on. So we're going to click here to search for a value. The tree browser pops up. Pop quiz. What are you supposed to look at first before you go drilling into here? What are you supposed to look at first? You're supposed to look at the title bar to find out what type of object we're looking for. We're looking for a VC::host system. That's an object that defines an ESXi host. Let's go find one. The button down here labeled Select is grayed out right now because we don't have a VC::host system selected. Let's drill our way down. Alright, so there's the plugin. Here's my vCenter server. And as I continue expanding, again, I'll explain all this up here in a moment, but I'm going to keep expanding till we find this folder called host. Now, as you might imagine, a lot of folks are going to think that this is, if we select this, that's going to make this button ungray. But the select button is not going to ungray. In fact, I can't even select host because this thing here is not a VC::host system. It's a VC::host folder, which you don't actually see labeled here, but this is a VC::host folder, not a VC::host system. That's why when I select this, the select button does not ungray. But let's expand it a bit further and see what's inside of it. So what we see inside of the host folder, actually let me collapse that again real quickly. The next level of things that we see in the host folder are clusters, or optionally, if we had a standalone host, they would show up at this level. But typically, the host folder is going to contain your clusters. And if you expand a cluster, such as my Site A Compute 01 cluster, you will see up top the list of the hosts, ESXi hosts, that are in that cluster. And I just need to pick one. I'm going to pick host 6 for reasons, I don't know. I'm just picking 6. So we're going to pick host 6, and as you can see, for all these objects I'm selecting, it gives you lots of interesting detail and information about them. But I'm going to select that as the host that we want our workflow to be building new VMs on. Now, since we happen to be here, I'd like to talk a bit more. So I'm done with the vmHost variable. I couldn't click select, but I'd like to talk about some of the other things that we see here since we happen to be here. You may have noticed, let me collapse this here, when we get to this level of the hierarchy, there's a folder called Data Centers and another folder called Storage Management. We're going to ignore storage management. It has to do with policy-based storage management, but that's a subject for another video. This folder here, though, called Data Centers is super important. The folder called Data Centers is not a data center. Again, don't confuse a data center folder with a data center. A data center is something like this guy here. You use data centers to organize your clusters and hosts. Typically, each data center is for a different geographically based data center in your IT environment. When you only have a single data center, you don't really need to organize that one data center. But if you had 10 data centers or 20 data centers or 100 data centers, being able to organize them comes in real handy. So even though you rarely see these, you have the ability to create something called a data center folder. To create one, you simply select the vCenter server, go over to Actions, and say that you want to create not a new data center. That creates one of these. I don't want to create a data center. I want to create something that I can use to organize data centers. So I'll say New Folder, and by virtue of where I created this VM folder, it knows that I want a data center folder. So I'm going to call this one My Data Center Folder. And notice if I wanted to, I could drag the data center and maybe a bunch of other data centers into that folder to keep them organized and separate from other data centers that I would store in other data center folders. But having created this data center folder, called My Data Center Folder, let's go back to Orchestrator. And I might have to refresh. I may even have to cancel here to see this, but let me try this here. If I expand again, notice that any data center folder that I create is going to land in this data centers folder that's automatically created. Very similar to the VM folder that gets automatically created and the host folder that automatically gets created. Whenever you create a vCenter server, not only do these 4 folders get created automatically, so does this one here. Actually, I should say when you create a vCenter server, the data centers folder gets created. When you create a data center, these 4 folders get created. They're created for you automatically so that when you create your own VM folder, we've got a place to put it. Or you create a host folder, we've got a place to put it. Or as I just showed you, when you create a data center folder, we need to have some place to put your data center folder. It's kind of like if you think of this in terms of like file systems, it's like the root directory of a file system. I got to have some place to put my data center folders. So anyways, I don't really care about this, my data center folder. We're just going to ignore it from here on out and continue drilling our way down into SA Data Center. So again, I'm going to continue drilling into host, into my cluster, and I'm going to pick host number 6. And again, since I happen to have information on the screen here, notice that when you're looking at a cluster, you can see all of the resource pools that belong to that cluster. You can see all of the networks, specifically all the standard virtual switch based networks and all the distributed virtual switch based networks that are known throughout that cluster. And as we continue onwards here, that's a bunch more distributed virtual switches. Plus, down here, you can also see that for that cluster, we can see all of its data stores that the cluster sees. And furthermore, If you drill instead into a specific host, you can see similar things. So here we are looking inside a specific host, and notice that when you're looking at a host, you can see its VM folders. You can see the data stores that this one host sees. And what else can you see on the host? You can see the networks, in this case, distributed virtual switch-based networks, that this host can see. So it looks like the same objects that we saw before. In fact, it is the same objects, but when you're drilled down into a host, you see the objects that the host sees. On the other hand, if you're drilled into a cluster, you see the objects that the cluster sees. All right, so we're going to pick this here host and continue onwards. Select, create, and we're going to try to pick up the speed here. So data stores next. So with vmDatastore, we're going to say create new, and we're just going to browse our way down and find a suitable data store. Now, I am intentionally going to pick a data store that's got hopefully some space. Notice if I select a data store like shared 01, we can see various information about it, including how much space has been provisioned and so forth. I'm going to actually take a look at the free space for each of these and find one that hopefully has got a lot of space. If I'm going to create 1,000 VMs, I need some space. So 107 gigabytes is pretty good. I'm going to leave this NFS data store alone. This other shared data store has got 101, and this one here has 19. I definitely don't want to pick that. So between 1 and 3. So 101 versus 107. Data store shared 01 has the most space, so I'm going to pick it. What else? We've got to pick the network that we want the VM plugged into. So just rapidly going through here, I'm going to drill through the tree to find the networks that are available. Again, I want to make certain that I pick something suitable. You'll notice here that these distributed virtual switch-based networks that I'm pointing to here are not selectable because they are not VC: networks. VC: network is the type definition for a network that is on a standard virtual switch. There's a different type of object called, don't quote me here, but I believe it's called VC: distributed port group is the name that of the type of variable that you would need the workflow to be looking for if you want to select these networks. Now, doing that's beyond the scope of this video, so I'm just going to pick the one and only standard virtual switch-based network that I have, and we'll click select and create. All right, we're almost done. We need to pick which resource pool we want the newly deployed VM to land in. So again, shortcutting all this and just drilling in to find a suitable resource pool. Let's see, in the host. Don't go into, notice here that this other cluster has a resource pool called resources. We don't want to select that because this resource pool on this wrong cluster isn't going to be accessible by the VM. So make certain that all the choices that you make here are consistent with each other. If I chose to deploy the machine, the new machine, onto a host in the compute 01 cluster, then I need to pick a resource pool from that same cluster. So I'm going to go into sa-compute 01, and here I've got yet another instance of something that's created automatically by default, but it's hidden over in the vSphere client. Any resource pools that I create would show up in the vSphere client, would show up as children of this. This is all of the resource pools. So I'm just going to select it. We'll click create. And let me double check things here. I've set up all my inputs. I set up my outputs. I probably should have been doing this more frequently, but I'm going to click the save button. Yes, I want to save. And now would be a good time to validate to see, is this workflow looking okay? The validation is successful. So let's close this and tell you what, let's actually run the workflow. So I'm going to run the workflow. And you'll recall we only created a single input parameter called virtual machine name, and that's what the user is being asked to specify. So why don't we create, since we're celebrating the 1,000 VVork YouTube channel subscribers, why don't we create a VM called actually, that's fine. Celebration VM. Now, this is a machine name. It's a host name. That's too long. Why don't we just call it CVM? CVM. Call it anything I want. Whatever. I just need to make certain that the name I pick is going to be permissible by things like DNS and WINS and so forth. So I'm going to go with this short name. In fact, I don't even want to deal with uppercase letters. I'm just going to call it CVM. There we go. So my celebration VM. I'm going to click run, and fingers crossed. Just because the workflow validated successfully doesn't mean necessarily that the workflow is semantically correct. So it doesn't have any compile time errors, but who knows? There may be some stupid runtime error, but it looks like it ran successfully. It says it completed. Let's go over to the vSphere client and see if there's anything. Looky here. In my VMs, there's this new VM called CVM. So it worked. Congratulations. Again, I said we're going to first of all create a workflow that creates one VM, and we succeeded. So let's go back to our agenda. Our agenda said that we were also going to start making some incremental modifications. So let's do that. In here, well, let's get rid of this VM. We don't need it anymore. We're going to right-click CVM and delete it and say yes, and we're going to say goodbye to that virtual machine. Okay, so now I have my workflow called create one VM. I'm going to go ahead and go back to workflows, and I'm going to use this as the basis for my next VM, my next workflow. But let me actually make a duplicate of it. We'll call the duplicate, the new one, the one that's going to have the incremental modifications, we're going to change its name by opening it up. And we're going to call it, instead of copy of create one VM, we're going to call this create a bunch of VMs. This is the name of this new workflow. Let's go ahead and save that. Yes, I want to save that. Okay, so there are a number of things that I want to do to enhance this workflow. One of which is I no longer want to ask the user to specify the name of the newly created VM. If my ultimate goal is to have 1,000 VMs get created by this workflow, I can't ask the user to give me 1,000 names. So we're going to automatically generate the names. We'll create VMs called things like, the VM names that we create will be called things like VM001, VM002. Actually, if we're going to create 1,000, it better be VM0001, VM002. So we're going to automatically generate those names in our workflow. So it's no longer going to give me an input parameter, because that would give the user control. Instead, we're going to specify the virtual machine name as a variable, an attribute, which puts us, the developer, in control. Now, those of you who are familiar with vRO 7 are familiar with the fact that in vRO 7 and earlier, if you wanted to change this input into an attribute, a variable, you could right-click it and change it from an input to a variable. But that doesn't work here in the new HTML5 client. I'm going to submit a feature request to get that to work. If I right-click like I used to in the vRO Java-based 7 Java-based client, it gave me a choice to change this into an attribute. But that doesn't work anymore. Instead, apparently what you need to do right now is to simply completely delete the input that you don't want anymore. And then go, if you want it as a variable, go over to variables and create yourself a new one. I'm going to create a new variable called virtual machine name. So in fact, it's the same name that I used before. And again, I should type a description. Here it's not as crucial because whereas an input description is what the user is going to be prompted with, here it doesn't matter because this is just going to be a variable that's internal to my workflow. I should type a name, but I'm trying to save some time here. Otherwise, this is going to be a horrifically long video. All right, so next thing up, type. A name is a string, so the default choice here is fine. And the value, you might expect me to type the value here, but I'm not going to because the workflow is going to set the value. So let's leave that blank. We'll click create. And if we go back to our schema, now that we've got this new variable, what we need to do is to have vmName. Notice it's automatically broken the binding that it had before. We need his VM input hooked up to our variable called virtual machine name. Well, the way we do that is the same as we've seen so many times before. Just click select variable. Here's the variable that we just created. It's no longer an input. It's now a variable, formerly known as an attribute. And boom, that's done. But since that variable, where's it hiding here, has no value, if we simply run this workflow, this other workflow that we're calling is going to blow up on us because it's not going to know the name of the VM, the name of the new VM that it's supposed to create. So we need to do this programmatically somehow. There's a variety of ways we can do this, but in this video, we're going to do this by dragging in a scriptable task that's going to be called before we actually create the VM. And the point of this scriptable task is going to be to generate the name for the VM. So generate the name of the VM. And again, we've got various things that we can set up. In this case here with the scriptable tasks never have any inputs. They never have any outputs until you define them. So what we're going to be able to do here is things like, well, ultimately, let's see here. Ultimately, we want our VMs to have names like VM0001. We want a portion of the name to be fixed. So I was going to say VM something. And then we want some sort of counter variable to keep track of which VM we're on. So the first time it'll create 0001, then 0002, and so forth. So let's do that. Why don't we, I could show you how to set up a variable to hold the prefix, but I'm just going to hard code that. Instead, what I'm going to do is create a variable called, a new variable called counter that's going to be used to keep track of which VM we're creating. So this is, I am going to type a description this time. This variable is used as a counter to keep track of which VM we're on. Okay. And it's not going to be a string. It's going to be a number. Let's choose a number. Whoops. Didn't mean to make that a configuration element. We'll leave that alone. Value. Well, we got to start counting somewhere. We could start counting from 1. Humans tend to like to count from 1. On the other hand, with computers, we tend to like to count from 0. It kind of depends on how we're going to define what this variable is. Is this counter variable going to keep track of how many VMs we've successfully created, or is it keeping track of which one we're on? Depending upon how you define this variable, that's going to affect what its initial value is. And furthermore, instead of calling this variable counter, we might want to call it something such as how many VMs. We might want to call the variable how many VMs have been successfully created so far. That's a horribly long name, which is why I chose counter instead. Or maybe the counter variable is keeping track of which VM number are we on. So picking a name more descriptive than counter could probably help. But definitely type a description so that whoever is reading your workflow will definitively know what the heck this variable is doing. To illustrate something later on, I'm going to choose to start the counter at 0. I could start it at 1, but we're going to say 0. All right, let's click Create. And now I have a counter variable. And in my schema, in that scriptable task, I can go to the input section and click Add to bring in my counter variable. I'm going to have to scroll down to see this here. There we go. There's my counter variable. Is it a string? It's not supposed to be a string. Hang on. Something went wrong. Go back to variables. I could swear I changed the type of counter. I just typed it. Maybe I need to hit the X there. Okay. You're my witness. I'm changing it to number. I'm choosing number. I'm saving. Counter is now a number, but I lost its value. When I changed its type, I lost its value. So counter is a number. Its starting value is 0. Click Save. I'm going to double check here. Counter is a number. Its initial value is 0. Shoo. Okay, so back to the Schema tab. Back to our scriptable task. Back to the Inputs Output section, where we're going to hit the Add button to add a new input. This is an input to the, not to my workflow, but rather an input to the scriptable task. And when we say Select Variable, we see lots of different variables, including counter. There we go. Counter is a number this time. And now my workflow variable is bound to a variable of the same name, but this guy here is actually a variable in the scriptable task. So when we're in the scriptable task and we reference the variable called counter, that's actually going to be getting its value from, or setting its value to, our workflow variable of the same name. Okay, so I'm going to be able to bring in the counter, and the reason why I want to do that is ultimately I want to write some code here for the scriptable task. So I'm going to go to the scripting tab. I want to write some code to do something like new, I forget what the variable's called. Actually, let me go back to the General tab. Actually, I'll stay here on the scripting tab. The reason why I'm stuttering and stammering here is I'm trying to remember the name of the variable that I want to store the new VM in. So I'm just going to create a temporary dummy variable right now. I'll change that later, but the name of the VM is going to be VM followed by a 4-digit number. And that number is going to be based on the counter, but we don't want the first VM to be called VM0000. We want the first VM to be called VM0001. So I'm going to go ahead and leave my counter starting at 0, but so that the first VM is called VM0001, I'm going to add 1 to that counter. So some variable that I need to find the name of is going to create a string that's going to be VM followed by the counter number. So that'll create VM1, VM2, VM3, and so forth. We'll deal with inserting the leading zeros in a little bit. All right, this is the wrong variable name. So let's go back to the General tab, and we're going to add a new input. Actually, in this case, it's not going to be an input. Inputs are for when we're trying to get information into the scriptable task. That's what we want to do with counter. We want to bring in the value of counter so that we know what the value of counter is. On the other hand, the variable that we're going to use to store the newly generated VM name is not an input, it's an output. So we'll click Add and select Variable. And here's where I'm going to be able to find what I called that variable. The variable is a string, and it's not new. You might be tempted to say new virtual machine, but that's not the right thing. That's not a string. That's not the name of the VM. That's a complex object that describes the resulting VM. Here it is down here. This string down here called virtual machine name is a string. That's the variable I want to store the newly generated name into. So I'll choose that. And now in my scripting, instead of saying dummy, let me get rid of that. I can either type virtual machine name, or I can just put the cursor in the right place and click here and it inserts it automatically. Okay, so I've now got code to generate the virtual machine name, sticks the value in this variable called virtual machine name, and we want to make certain that that value gets passed to the workflow element that's going to create the VM. So we are going to make certain that the workflow we're calling gets passed into its vmName variable the same thing. So this schema element is writing out a new virtual machine name to the variable called virtual machine name. And this schema element is reading in that same value. And if this all worked, let me click Save. if I've done everything correctly here, I should be able to validate. Successful. I should be able to run this workflow. And I'm going to run the workflow. Looks like it ran successfully. If we go over to vSphere client, notice that we have a VM called VM1, which is close. We've made some incremental progress here. We now have the name of the VM being dynamically generated by our workflow, but there's two more problems here. One, we set out to create 1,000 VMs. That's only one VM. So we're going to need to do something to create more than one VM in our workflow. And additionally, I don't want to create VMs called VM1, VM2, and so forth, because later on when I get to VM10 and VM20 and so forth, it makes sorting them lexicographically here in the vSphere client, they end up looking weird. It'd say, instead of saying VM1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it'll say VM1, VM10, VM2, VM... That's why I want those leading zeros. So I'm actually going to go back into the vRO client. And we're going to make a simple little change here to this code. I'm still looking at the workflow token. I need to look at the workflow if I want to make changes to it. So let me go over to workflows. I'll find my workflow. I'll open it up. Now I'm not in read-only mode. I'm in read-write mode. And I am going to go over here to the Schema tab. And in the Schema tab, we'll go to that scriptable task. We'll go to its scripting tab. And what I was trying to do was, first of all, start by commenting out that code. And I've cheated and already, we're going to use this new code. Now, I may need to change it slightly here because, for instance, this variable here is the wrong name. I need to change that here. But ultimately, what this code is doing is, instead of generating names like VM1, VM2, VM3, VM4, and so forth, it's going to pad with leading zeros. Again, it's going to take the counter number, add 1 to it, so the first VM will be VM001. And to get it to have the leading zeros, we're going to pad it with, actually, I don't want 3. I want 4 digits, because by the time we get to 1,000, we need 4 digits. So this function here called pad, which I've defined up above, is going to add the leading zeros that we want. So if we try this out here, yeah, I think the code looks good. The only other thing that I've done here is I want to be able to see if this workflow is actually doing what I want it to do. So I'm going to do some logging. And for reasons that'll become apparent a little later on, instead of doing a system.log, I'm going to do a system.warn. Again, we'll find out why later on. But all I'm going to be doing is logging the name that got generated. Please note that in addition to changing the name of the variable here, I also had to change the name of the variable here. So this is what our final code looks like. Feel free to hit the pause button and examine this code. Okay, so this looks good so far. Let's save. Let's validate. And let's run it. Actually, before I do, I need to go over to the vSphere client and make certain I get rid of VM1. Otherwise, we're going to collide with it. All right, back to Orchestrator. We're going to run the workflow. So we click Run. Workflow, we've got some sort of warning here. I'm going to ignore that for the time being. Workflow looks like it's running. In fact, if we go look at the logs, the reason why I did the system.warning is I want to filter out all these infos. So since I did a system.warning, I can say I don't want to see all the messages. I don't want to see the infos. I just want to see anything that's a warning or worse. So warning, it's not really nothing wrong here. I'm just using the warning thing for filtering. But my logging here says that the name of this VM that just got created is VM001. And if we go over to the vSphere client, we do, in fact, have a VM called VM001. So we got that. Let's delete him. All right. So now we've got the ability in our workflow to dynamically generate names. So what we need to do next, names for the VMs that we're creating, what we need to do next is, instead of just having a linear workflow that does this, then this, and this, and just does it once, what we need to do is create a loop. There are multiple ways of creating loops, one of which involves this thing here called the for each schema element. But we're going to, that's a newer way of creating loops. We're going to create a loop an older fashioned way by using something called a decision element. So I'm going to drag a decision element into my workflow. And the point, let me drag that again. There we go. The point of I don't know where that came from. The point of a decision schema element is to ask a question. The question here in our workflow is going to be, are there more VMs to create? So we're going to start off creating VM number 1, and we're not going to be done until we get up to VM 1000. So we are going to change the label of this decision to something a little more descriptive, like more VMs to create. So are there VMs left to create? And by the way, if you're a vRO 7 person, there used to be 3 different types of decisions. Now there's only 2 because this single one here can either be a simple or custom decision. So right now I have custom decision. If I want a simple decision, I just slide the slider. But we're going to do a custom decision, which many of you know from previous videos. A custom decision allows us a lot of control over how this decision is going to work. But ultimately, the point of this decision is we want to create a loop. Let me, again, do what I can to get that label to change there. Come on, change label. There we go. What we want to do is have a loop so that if there's still more VMs to create, we're going to generate a name, create the VM, and we want to loop back around and keep doing that until we have created enough VMs. Now, in order to know how many VMs we've created, we're going to need a variable, and we'll set that up in a moment, but let's actually create the loop itself. I'm going to sort of scoot things around for reasons that'll become apparent in a moment. Conceptually, what I want to do is to create a loop that looks like this. So if there are more VMs to create, we're going to generate a name, we're going to create one VM, and then we're going to go back and ask, are there more VMs to create? So to do that, in the old vRO client, you could just drag the endpoint and drop it here to create the loop. In the new HTML5-based client, you have to delete the endpoint. Go to the last schema element here, click its blue arrow, and then drag to create the loop. So now I have a loop, but I don't know when to get out of the loop. I know that to get out of the loop, I'm going to need to know how many VMs have I created so far, but I also need to know how many VMs I want to create. So I already have a variable to keep track of how many VMs I've created. That's what that counter variable is. But I need a variable to know how many VMs total we want to create. So I'm going to create a variable. It's going to be a new variable. And we'll call this variable something exciting like number of VMs already created. Now, obviously, you could pick a shorter name than that. When we start off, there's going to be, actually, it's not the number of VMs already created. That's what the counter variable is. What am I talking about? We want to know number of VMs to create. Now, ultimately, we're going to set that it's a number. It's not a string. It's a number. Ultimately, we want to set the value of this variable to 1,000, but who knows what kind of problems I'm going to have with this workflow to start off with. So I'm going to just set it to something small, like create 3 VMs. All right, so in my decision element, what I want to do is say, okay, we have a variable that says how many VMs we want to create, and another variable that says how many we've created, and if one is greater than the other, that's going to be the signal to leave the loop. So let's actually go define this decision and the test that it performs. So the test is going to be based on 2 inputs. So I'll hit add. The first input is going to be it doesn't matter which order I choose these. So I'm going to choose counter as one of the variables the decision's based on. And we also need to know another variable that tells us how many VMs we want to create. So in my decision, I'm saying the decision is going to be based on those 2 variables. But I still have to define the code that gets performed when we hit that decision element. Now I can write this code lots of different ways, but let's try to keep this fairly intuitive. So I'm going to say if some expression, we'll type this expression in a moment, if that expression evaluates to true, then we're going to want to do something. Otherwise, we're going to want to do something else. If it returns, if that expression evaluates to true, we're going to return true. If the expression evaluates to false, we'll return false. So what is this expression I keep talking about? Well, the expression is going to be something like, if the counter is greater than, or maybe greater than equal to. Haven't really thought through the logic here entirely, but let's try this here first. If counter, the number of VMs we've already created, is greater than the number of VMs to create, let me actually copy and paste that since my typing seems to be really bad today. So if the counter is greater than or equal to the number of VMs we're supposed to create, well, what's that mean? Does that mean we want to leave the loop, or do we want to stay in loop? So if the counter is greater than, that's when we're supposed to exit the loop. So let's change the logic around here a little bit. It's not when counter is greater than. When counter is less than the number of VMs we're trying to create, then we want to return true, because that will cause us to follow the green arrow and create the next VM, and create the next VM, and create the next VM. If we set the return type to true, that means we're going to follow the green arrow into the loop and create our next VM, which is exactly what we want to do. All right, so this code looks mostly correct. By the way, if you wanted to, instead of typing the code that you see on the screen here, you can type the code different ways. For instance, you could just say return that expression, and that'll do the same thing. So whichever way you want. I'm going to use this shorter notation here. So now we have a way of knowing when to exit the loop, except we don't have anything increasing or incrementing the counter. That's the next thing we're going to do in our workflows. We're going to go to the basic section here, and in the basic section, there's this counter variable incrementer called increaseCounter. I'm going to drag that into my workflow at the end of the loop. So when we're done generating a name and creating a VM, we want to go and bump up the counter number. So we add a counter incrementer here, and like other schema elements, we need to hook it up. It has an input that it calls counter that we're going to hook up to our variable called the same thing. But we need not only to have an inward binding, we also need an outward binding to that same variable. Counter variables, you always have to have both an inward and outward binding, which I do. So his counter variable is hooked up both inwardly and outwardly to our workflow's counter variable. All right, things are looking good so far. Let me save. Let me validate. And let's run this workflow. And it looks like it's running. Well, we go look at the logs tab. And again, I'm going to set that filtering again. Just show me warning. Here we go. So if we just look at the log messages that we're interested in, VM001, VM002, VM003, and VM004 all got created. If we go over to the vSphere client, they all got created. So we actually at this point have a workflow that if we just made one tiny change would be able to at least attempt to create the 1,000 virtual machines we're trying to create. But before we change it from 3, actually let's get rid of those VMs. Let's see, VMs, selected VMs. Before we go overboard and do that, let me delete those VMs. We could, at this point, just go to our workflow, open the workflow, go to its variables tab, and crank up this number from 3 to 1,000. But I want to make our challenge even harder here. We're not just going to create the VMs, which is going to consume disk space. I want to also power them on, which is going to definitely start beating up on my tiny lab environment. So before I do that, let me maybe organize things a little more cleanly here. We don't just want to create the VM. Let's actually power on each VM. Now there's a workflow that we can call to do that, but for reasons I'm not going to go into, I'm actually going to call more directly an action called start. Is it start VM or start virtual machine? Something like that. Let's go find it. Start VM, I believe is the name. Yeah, not this PowerShell one, but this vSphere action will start a VM. The trick is if you want to call a VM, if you want to power on a VM, if you want to call this action that's going to power on the VM, it has an input that needs us to supply the VM that we want powered on, and it needs to know which host we want the VM to power up on. So we can actually, in some cases, power up the VM on a host other than the one that it's actually currently on. Plus, there's also, for the action, a output called action result, which we'll look at in a moment. So to get started here, I don't like this label. I'm going to change that label to power on VM. And I'm going to start setting up these inputs. So VM. We need to pass into this action the VM that we just created. Now you recall that when we created the VM in the previous schema element, we stored the VM in a variable, actually it was a variable called new VM. That's one of those complex things called the VC::virtual machine. We need to feed this into the next schema element. So to do that, we're going to do some binding. We'll select the action we want to call. We'll set up its VM, and we'll tell it, take that variable that the previous schema element stuck a virtual machine in, take that variable, and that's the VM we want powered on. And similarly, for this host, we've already got a variable called vmHost that's an object that holds the host that the VM was created on. If we wanted to, we could have another another VC::host system, but we'll just use the same host. We'll click that, and we're done with that. So we've got the input set up. The other thing that we need to do here, though, is to capture the output of this action. The output of the workflow that we called was a virtual machine. The output of this action is not a virtual machine. The output of this is not a virtual machine. It's not a host. It's not a data store. It's something called a task object, a VC::task. If you've ever been in the vSphere client and you saw a bunch of tasks running, that's what a VC task keeps track of. So when we call this action to power on the virtual machine, the action returns a task so that later on we can examine that task object to see is the power on operation done? And lots of other things. We could even do things like take that VC::task object and cancel the power on if we wanted. What I'm going to do, though, is actually capture the VC::task that originates in a variable in the action called action result, and we're going to capture it in our own variable. We're going to call it our variable task, but in reality, we're just going to ignore its value. So if I have a variable now called task that I can use to check on the status of the power on, but I don't want to wait around on the power on. We're just going to have this loop run faster by capturing the task object, but we're just never going to look at it. So having done that, we're looking pretty good here. Let's save and validate. Looking good. And we'll run the workflow. Just before I do, though, let me go over to the variables tab and make certain that we've got a low number set here. I'll tell you what, we'll bump up this number to, let's bump it up to 10. I'm feeling a little bit more adventurous. We'll bump it up to 10. We'll save the workflow. I'm not going to bother validating. That change was so minor, I'm not going to bother validating. But let's run the workflow just before we do. The vSphere client, there's no VMs. We're going to run this workflow. It starts running. If we watch the logs tab and maybe turn on only show me warnings, we can see it doing its thing. It's created VM1, powered it on. Creating VM2 and powering it on. And it's going to keep doing that one VM at a time. There are ways we could do this in a more parallel fashion, an asynchronous way. Instead of using that workflow element, there's another schema element called asynchronous workflow. It would create the VMs. It'll take just as long to create the VMs, but the call to create the VM would be instantaneous. But that's a subject for another video. So anyways, we've got VM001, VM002, VM003, and so forth. Looks like, we've got everything working correctly, but we ended up with, you may have noticed before, we didn't have 3 VMs created, we got 4. And here we don't have 10 VMs, we've got 11, because we got a little intentional boo-boo in our workflow. So something's causing our loop to loop one time too many. And that's just because, let me go over to the workflow, let me go into my workflow, let me go to the schema tab, let me look at the decision. That's where we're looping too many times because this decision ain't right. The decision is saying if the counter is less than or equal to number of VMs to create, all we need to do to fix this is, instead of testing for less than or equal, in this particular case, we should be testing for less than. Now, I'll let you pause the video and stop and think about why that's going to make the difference. And even better, I'll let you pause and think about how to think about this type of decision element, especially when you're doing looping. There are classic mistakes that people make where you're just off by 1. Having the equal sign when you didn't need it, or not having an equal sign when you did need it, are classic sources of off by 1 type errors. So I intentionally added that in there because I just wanted you to see it. And I'm going to trust that my workflow is valid. I'm not going to do that again. Not going to do the validation. I am, however, going to go over and clean up all these lovely virtual machines. I first have to power them off. Let's see here. Can't delete them unless I power them off, so let's power them off. I should do a graceful shutdown, but there's no OS in them anyways. So I'll just rudely power them off so that I can turn around and delete them all. Waiting for the last of them to power off. Come on, VM001. You can do it. You can do it. Well, while we're waiting for VM001, I'm going to delete the others. So we're deleting those VMs. They're going away. Why is VM001 fighting me here? Let me refresh. I'll just try. No, I can't delete him until he's powered off. Power off, you bad boy. There we go. He's powered off. And we're going to delete him. Okay, so now the big moment has arrived. We are going to crank up the number of VMs to create to, not change the name, but change the number of VMs. And I didn't say this explicitly, but I was also testing, the reason why I chose 10 VMs is I wanted to make certain that my leaving 0 VM naming mechanism was working correctly. I believe it is, so we're going to save our workflow one more time. Maybe we'll even close out this time. We're going to run the workflow from out here. It doesn't matter where we run it, but I'm going to run the workflow. This sucker is already running, and it's creating the virtual machines as we speak. And this is going to be a bit problematic. So the first 10 or so is going to be fine. vSphere has all sorts of CPU and memory management mechanisms to allow small environments like my lab environment to run lots and lots of virtual machines. But I guarantee you, my lab environment is so small, this is eventually going to start causing problems. We may be able to create all 1,000 VMs, although we won't be able to power them all on. I'm positive about that. I'm not even certain it's going to be able to create all 1,000 virtual machines, because even though I'm using thin provisioning, 1,000 virtual machines is going to chew up some disk space. So we're going to let this run for a while and check in. I'll probably speed up the video or clip parts out to see what kinds of interesting things happen. But while we let it create these 1,000 virtual machines in my terribly undersized lab environment, I'd like to once again thank you all for subscribing, all 1,000 of you. So I'm going to stop yakking, and let's see what happens here. Okay, let's take a look. All right, so we're in the vSphere client. Hey, here's all those VMs. We're up to number 16 so far. That's pretty cool. But wait, there's hosts and clusters view. Let's go up there and see what's going on with our hosts. You'll recall, we've actually got 6 different hosts in our clusters. The first 3 are our management cluster. The last 3 are our compute cluster. Here's the host that we're actually building machines on. That's host number 6. And sure enough, here are all of its machines, its VMs. Whoa, we're up to 19 now. We're cruising. Let's keep going. What else have we got going in here? We could go monitor. Why don't we go monitor? How about, we should go to the advanced view. Because there's all sorts of cool things there. For instance, oh my goodness, here's the CPU usage in percentage. That doesn't look good. Anyways, what else is going on here with my other resources? Do I have any others? Oh my gosh, I've got memory. Let's go look at memory. Oh, that's not good. Active memory is just spiking there. This could be trouble. Anyways, back to the CPU. But wait, what else do we got here? Oh my goodness, we got 30 VMs going now. Wait, some time passes. That's what the ripples mean. Some time passes. Let's go look at the cluster, because I haven't said this before. This is a DRS cluster, and all these crazy VMs are being automatically migrated using, you guessed it, vMotion migration between the different hosts. Host 4, 5, and 6. Back to host number 6. What do we got going on now? Okay, this is definitely not good. The CPU situation's not getting any better, and after time goes by, it's still not going any better. So, hey, there's the neighbor with his chainsaw. But wait, over here, we're looking at memory, and oh my goodness, look what's happening here. This is kind of interesting. The active memory usage is going down. That's vSphere mechanisms. Oh, and same thing with CPU. These are advanced memory and other mechanisms in vSphere helping us to handle this crazy load that we're putting on to our overloaded infrastructure here. But wait, we've also got data stores and stuff, and we're going to check these, but hang on. I need to go run an errand. I'll check back with you in a moment. Hey, wait a second. Look at that. Average memory usage is going down, or not memory usage, memory active is going down. That kind of makes me hopeful. That means this stuff might actually be able to handle the load. Well, let's keep taking a look around here and maybe we'll see something interesting. Oh, there's a blank screen. And there's a, oh, wait, what's this? It's like, wow, we got a bunch of machines powered on. That's not so bad. Well, if only I could see the names of those machines, it would be so much nicer. Oh, there we go. Hey, check that out. We've got 100 VMs running, but wait a sec. I don't know if you saw that. Looks like about 90 of them are powered on, and then the next few are not powered on. Oh, we're getting some intermittent problems powering these suckers on, but they're still building. So apparently I don't have enough resources to run all these, but when it finds the resources, it builds them and runs them. And if it doesn't have the resources to fire up the new machines, at least it's still building them. In fact, oh my gosh, we're up to 235 VMs right now. That's crazy. Cue amazing zoom effect now. Hey, it worked. Look what else is working. Our orchestrator workflow is still chugging along. It's created 260, 261, 262 VMs, but take a look down below. Again, we can see it creates the machine successfully, but it is unable to power them on. Although we're not seeing it right now, but I've noticed that sometimes it will be able to power a few on as things vMotion migrate, and so we're not completely unable to power on VMs, but it's got to wait for vSphere mechanism to kick in and free up resources. I don't know about you, but I think it's time to speed this up. So here we are, hundreds of VMs created, but notice, whereas before we're suffering some insufficient resources, oh, nope, now they're back again. So as vSphere shuffles around these machines that we're creating, if it's got the resources to build, it builds, and so far, it's building every VM. But those darn VMs don't always power on because sometimes there just ain't enough memory or something, or memory, CPU. We got disk-based, otherwise we wouldn't be able to build machines, but it's either memory or CPU. Probably memory, that's my guess. Okay, slowing it down again so we can see how we're doing. Let's see how many VMs we got. Holy cow, 343. This is building machine after machine. Who would have thought my rinky 344? Who would have thought my rinky 345? Who would have thought my rinky-dink infrastructure could handle this many? There's 346. Ah, there's 346. It built it, can't power it on. Again, there's probably not enough memory is my guess. There's got to be enough disk space, otherwise it wouldn't be able to build the machines. So we got some sort of shortage with CPU or memory is what I'm thinking. But let's let it go. 349. Can't do 350. No way. No way. It did it. Now let's just cruise along. Well, let's let it do its thing. Time again for super fast mode. Once again, we slow down. It's almost as if I know something's up. Oh, it just occurred. All right, so what's going on here? Creating virtual machine, insufficient memory resources. Actually, it doesn't say memory resources, it just says insufficient resources. I don't think it's memory anymore. Again, memory or CPU was what would have caused us to be unable to power on the VMs, but now notice, create virtual machine says insufficient resources. I think now we're talking disk space. We're out of disk space. And secondly, in our attempts to power on the virtual machines, now it's just going really ugly belly up on us. So module monitor loop power on, I don't even know what that message is. And this is a pre-recorded recording, so I can't check that. Yeah. Anyways, I think we've hit our limit here. What do? We did three. Oh, whoa, hang on. We're doing some migrations. Is it going to recover from this? We're up to 373 VMs, but what's it doing now? Okay, it's trying to migrate. Well, okay, it's succeeding in some. Well, not all the migration. Did I tell you, by the way, at the beginning here that doing this was actually a stupid idea because I'm totally hammering my environment. Anyways, it seems to be cruising along. Wait, hang on. Looks like I'm supposed to be showing something else on the screen. What am I looking at? I don't know. This looks like Orchestrator, But hang on, I think we need to do a magic fast forward here to figure out what's going on. Hang on. All right, I remember why I went into Orchestrator. So I wanted to see what was going on in Orchestrator. So here we are looking at the workflow runs. See that one on the top there? It says I failed. That's the most recent run. These other 4 have nothing to do with what I'm doing now. So I looked at the most recent workflow run, the one that failed. Workflow runs are also known as workflow tokens. And this one says, create VM error, insufficient resources. So yeah, it's kind of consistent with what we're seeing. Again, I don't think it's CPU. These VMs don't have any OSs in them, so they're not really doing anything, but they are consuming memory. But I think what we eventually ran out of was disk space. So we look in our log, let's see, it's creating this VM, creating that VM, and it just cruises along until this looks like a stack, stack, dump, trace. What's it say here? So again, we got the 374, VM 374. Now we're getting that error message. So insufficient resources, stack trace, pretending I'm reading this. I was reading it before. I did the voiceover on this video, but right now I'm just pretending to read this. More stack trace, dunes. Oh, okay. Now that I'm done looking at that, if you look at this active memory, that's kind of interesting. Active memory after a while just sort of tamped down. The VMs weren't really doing anything. But wait, what we really want to look at is the situation with that data store. Remember, shared 01 MS remote is my data store that we're using. We've got an error. Well, duh. As you can see here, it says I've got 150 megabytes left over out of the 250 gigs I started with. Hey, what's that smiley face doing up there? Stop smiling. We don't have any disk space. I can't even create VMs anymore. But the good news here is my entire infrastructure hasn't completely blown up on me. That's a good sign. And my infrastructure hasn't burst into flames. But wait, there's more. I know the music stopped, and that's my cue to shut up and be done with this already, but there's a few more things I wanted to point out. One of which is, you'll recall that I have 2 different clusters. One's my compute cluster. The other is my management cluster. The compute cluster consists of hosts 1, 2, and 3, and the management cluster is 4, 5, and 6. As you can see here, it appears we have a questionable design in this environment here. I can see my data store, the one that's all full, is accessible and visible to all 6 of my hosts, including the management host. Now, maybe the management cluster hosts aren't actually using this data store number 1, but if they are, then we got a problem with a lot more than just not being able to do a machine. So do make certain that when you create your clusters, that management clusters are designed to be completely isolated from your compute clusters. Repeat after me. Duh. All right, here's the other thing I wanted to show you. So notice I'm opening up a workflow, and on the summary tab of a workflow, you've got these sections down here, one of which is labeled resume workflows from failed behavior. This one would have been great in this particular case because by default, workflows, if they run into any problem at all, they just die. But in this case here, maybe I would have wanted to have my workflow paused, and that would give me the opportunity to go out and fix the problem in my infrastructure, add more disk space. Well, that's what this set of options allows us to do here. Again, that's workflow resume from failed behavior. On the other hand, don't confuse that with server restart behavior. This is the thing that turns on and off the checkpoint of your workflows. So if your workflow server restart behavior is set to resume workflow and your orchestrator server blows up while your workflow is running, that means that your orchestrator workflow will resume the next time the orchestrator server restarts. And as you can see here, I'm now apparently clicking on VMs. I don't know what I'm looking at anymore. This is all pre-recorded. I'm just doing a voiceover, and you've been listening for a while, and you're done with this. So I'm just going to wrap it up right now. You're still here? You watched the whole video? Holy cow, you're dedicated. Well, you deserve some credit for that. Tell you, why don't you go toot your horn somewhat? Go to the YouTube comments down below and why don't you write a message saying something like, I watched the whole video. You deserve credit. Anyways, let's get out of here.